Shalom and welcome to Ner L'Raglai Jewish Ministries, teaching the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. So today we'll be continuing with our study of the book of Daniel. And today we will start Daniel chapter 4. Now I've given this teaching a title, Awake and Be Alert. It's kind of more than a title, it's kind of an exhortation for us all to be awake and be alert. And I think we'll see the significance as we get into the chapter. But before we actually get into chapter 4, I want to just go back to chapter 3 for a minute and just give a little teaching on the young men that not the young men, but the men who grew up, right? The young men who grew up, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We don't see them anymore after chapter 3. So we finished chapter 3 last week, and we won't see these guys anymore. They're never mentioned anymore in the book of Daniel. They just had no significant events. And we've been talking about these young men, and in our question and answer time, there's been this question of whether or not Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were eunuchs when they went into the service of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we want to answer that question today because it is an important question. It gets brought up a lot of times when we talk about the book of Daniel, and especially these 4 Jewish young men who were exiled and grew up in the Babylonian kingdom. Now, I need to just state that it's never stated in scripture, right, that these guys were eunuchs. Now, but I did share a prophecy in the book of Isaiah, and as a result of this prophecy, some have, in their translations, they have the word eunuchs. When we look at this prophecy in the book of Isaiah again, it's in Isaiah 39, and this is 150 years before the Babylonian exile, at the time of King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah had just been healed. Some Babylonian officials came to him, and Isaiah said to him that his descendants would go to Babylon. And this is the judgment really that was given to Hezekiah at that time. And Isaiah 39:7, it says, "And some of your sons who will issue from you," meaning from Hezekiah, "whom you will beget, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon." So the word officials here is the word saris, and some translations use the word eunuch. And so that's how this originally came up. There are some translations that will translate this word as eunuch. And so we want to answer this question of whether or not these 4 Jewish men were considered eunuchs in the kingdom. Now, first of all, it's important to point out that when I taught on this a few weeks ago, I was showing how this was a prophecy given 150 years earlier, before the exile, and how some of the actual descendants of Hezekiah would go into exile to Babylon. Now, we don't know if Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego actually were from the royal line. They could have just been from nobility, whatever, from more well-to-do households. We don't know. And we do know that there was a certain king that was taken, one of the kings of Judah, along with all of his family and many people at that time, in the second deportation in 597. So this prophecy was definitely fulfilled, and whether or not it speaks of Daniel and his friends, we don't know. But getting back to the real subject is this word saris, right? So sometimes it's translated as officials, sometimes as eunuch, and how should we understand it? Now, just to say that there are many words in Hebrew that can have 2 or more meanings, and it is only the context that determines the meaning or translation of a word. Now, the word saris is generally translated as an official in the service of a king, but it can also specifically mean a eunuch. It depends on the context as to how it is translated. It often comes to a judgment call by translators. I just want to emphasize that it's difficult sometimes to understand. Should we translate it this way or that way? Translation work is not easy. Now, again, I emphasize here that context is king. This is a biblical principle when studying and teaching the scriptures. You always have to understand the context. Therefore, we will look at several examples that contain this word saris. we see this word in the book of Esther. And I'm teaching this just a couple days after Purim, and we just read the book of Esther, right? And we see this word used 12 times in the book of Esther, beginning here in Esther 1, verse 10. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zetar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs, right? This word is Sarisim, the plural of Saris, who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. So it's possible that these men, these 7 men, were eunuchs, since they had access to the court of the women, right? So the context helps us to define that word. But in chapter 2, verse 3, we read this: let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, right? The word saris, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. So Haggai was the king's saris, eunuch, who was in charge of the harem of the king. The Hebrew in the verse we just read, Esther 2:3, literally reads, Saris HaMelech Shomer HaNashim, the king's official who kept watch over or guarded the women. The context and text make it very clear that Haggai was most likely a eunuch. Totally fits the context. Now, we first see this word saris in the book of Genesis, and we see it in connection to Joseph when he went down to Egypt, and it's used of Potiphar, who is one of Pharaoh's officials. So we read it in Genesis 37:36. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him, meaning Joseph, in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Genesis 39:1. So the word saris is used of Potiphar along with another title. And we'll look at this in more detail here. So in both of these verses we just read, we see the description and title of Potiphar as Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. And in Hebrew we read, Saris Paro Sar Hatabachim. Now, Saris is a very general word, again, meaning an official or an officer in the kingdom. And this is where we see this very, used in its general sense. And then we see the second title used for Potiphar, the captain, literally Sar, of the bodyguard, right? So we see these 2 titles, and they're clearly talking about this man who was an officer, an official in the service of the king, of the Pharaoh, right? Now, Potiphar was married, as we read in Genesis 39:7, which totally negates the whole eunuch status for him. So this is clearly being used simply of an officer in the kingdom. Now, the word saris in the book of Daniel is only found in chapter 1, and I list the verses there, and it's only used for one particular person. And this was of this man Ashpenaz, who has the title of the chief of his officials, meaning the chief of the king's officials. And then in Daniel 1:7, we see the commander of the officials, right? And so in both these words, the officials is the word saris. So the chief officer, Ashpenaz, is addressed by these 2 different titles. One is Rab Sarisiv, meaning the king's officials, and the other one is Sar HaSarisim, the prince or chief of the officials, right? So both of them are the head of these of the officials. He had a high ranking, right? So the context in Daniel chapter 1 is more consistent with an officer of the king and not a eunuch. And that's why it's generally translated that way in translations. Now we see the same title used in the book of Jeremiah when Nebuchadnezzar ordered the destruction of Jerusalem, when we read the names of his military leaders. And there's a lot of names as well as titles that are just transliterated here from the different languages. So we read this in Jeremiah 39:3. Then all the officials of the king of Babylon came in and sat down at the middle gate. Negal Shar Ezer, Samgar Nebul, Sar Sekim, the Rav Saris, Sagar Sarnezer, the Rav Mag, and all the rest of the officials of the king of Babylon. And then we see another, so anyway, we see the name Sar Sekim, the Rav Saris, right? So Rav Saris meaning the chief of the officials, or chief official, really. And then again, here we see the name Nebuchadnezzar, the Rav Saris. We don't need to read this whole verses here, but clearly in this context, Saris is an official in the king's service for military reasons. Now we have another example here in 2 Kings 18:17, again used in the days of King Hezekiah. And this is a different kingdom, though. This is the king of Assyria, right? So we'll read this verse. Then the king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rav Saris and Rav Shekah from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a large army to Jerusalem. So they went up to Jerusalem and so on. But again, this is a chief military official to the Assyrian king. So very consistently, we see how it's used of a high official to the king. So my conclusions here in looking at these verses, although Daniel and his friends served the king of Babylon, they were never called Sarasim or anything similar in Aramaic. So that word is never used of them. That's number one. So were Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego married while they lived in Babylon? The text never says one way or another. It is best to let the text speak for itself and not force an opinion on it. And I stress here, an argument from silence is not a valid argument, right? People want to say, oh, well, it never mentions a wife or children. Okay, so what? We cannot use an argument from silence to say one thing or the other. We know what we know, and just to understand how that word saris is used, there is nothing in the text of the book of Daniel that suggests that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were eunuchs. My own opinion regarding the marital status of Daniel and the others, since Daniel stayed in Babylon after Cyrus released the Jews to return to Jerusalem after the 70 years were complete, right? Daniel didn't go back. And I think this is a good sign that he may have been single, because if he was married with kids and grandkids, more than likely Daniel, knowing his character from the book of Daniel, he would have made an effort to go back to Jerusalem to fulfill that prophecy and to see the next generation established there. So that's just my opinion, again, so you can take it or leave it. And then the marital status of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is unknown, just like Daniel. We don't know. They're not mentioned. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not mentioned again after Daniel 3. So that's what we know, and we will just leave it there. Hopefully that brings some clarity to this understanding of whether or not these men were eunuchs. It never says it. We should not assume it. Okay, let's move on to Daniel chapter 4, part 1. Again, the title being Awake and Be Alert. So I want to begin with a verse from Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, which is a spiritual truth, a universal truth. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. A healthy fear of God is a good thing in life. And the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4 illustrates this point well, right? So Daniel chapter 4 really is a testimony of this Gentile king, King Nebuchadnezzar. So what is the context of Daniel chapter 4? The timing and the timing of the events in this chapter seem to fit in chronological order together with the sequence in chapters 1 to 6. I've talked about this from the beginning, how chapters 1 to 6 are, as far as we know and from the evidence we have, they are in chronological order, and it seems to flow in a sequence. There is no definite year mentioned in this chapter, in Daniel chapter 4, but it appears to be sometime after the events of Daniel chapter 3, meaning sometime after 586 BCE. And I again mentioned this, that Daniel chapter 4 verses 1 to 3 in English Bibles is the equivalent to chapter 3 verses 31 to 33 in the Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, it's not really a language difference, but it's dependent on the tradition, meaning either the Jewish tradition or the Christian tradition. This is just how to number the chapters and verses. Generally, they parallel each other. Once in a while, there's a few verses off, and now we see an example here. And again, chapters and verses are not inspired, so we don't need to be, surprised or thinking that this is a mistake. This is simply, men have put chapters and verses in to help us find chapters and verses, which is good. But sometimes there's a difference in the Jewish and Christian rendering of these verses. So, and some translations like German or Japanese, other translations may follow the Hebrew, the Jewish numbering. So just so you know, there may be 3 verses off if you don't have a English translation. So I'm going to be following the English rendering. Let's begin in verse 1. So this is the introduction here to Daniel chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Now, I mentioned here this is a great bridge, it's a good bridge between Daniel chapters 3 and 4. And I really think it fits best as an introduction to Daniel chapter 4, and not just tacked on to the end of Daniel chapter 3, because there is a unique change that we see in King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4, which we will see as we go through this chapter. Now, previously, Nebuchadnezzar had recognized the exalted power of Daniel's God with the dream and interpretation of Daniel chapter 2, as we read here in verse 47. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of lords and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. So Nebuchadnezzar perceived that Daniel's God certainly had power above other gods, but he had not forsaken his own gods, as we read in Daniel chapter 3. Now, at the end of Daniel chapter 3, after the whole incident with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar declared their God as the Most High God. We read here in Daniel 3:26, that Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. So then I asked this question, is it sufficient to declare that the God of the people of Judah is the Most High God? Is this enough to simply say, well, your God's the Most High God? Is that coming to faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I think it's acknowledging his strength, but I think there's still something lacking there. So what is the difference between between the events of Daniel chapters 2 and 3 and the events in Daniel chapter 4? Now we read this at the end of Daniel chapter 3 again. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants who put their trust in him. So again, although the king, Nebuchadnezzar, honored their God, he was just a God of these foreigners. He was the God of these 3 Jewish men. And we see that kind of language in Daniel's chapters 2 and 3, but we see something very different as we come to Daniel chapter 4. It then became personal for the king as he declared to the world what the Most High God had done for him, right? And that's what we read at the end of verse 2 here, right? Nebuchadnezzar says, it has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. This is the Aramaic word imi, literally with me or for me. It was now personal to King Nebuchadnezzar, this God, this Most High God. Nebuchadnezzar was declaring how the Most High God had influenced his life, and he made a public declaration to the world, right? What we read in Daniel 4:1 here, Nebuchadnezzar the king to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. Now, why does the king address all peoples? And I explain here that when a person encounters the living God of heaven, it is impossible to keep this news to oneself. The king had to testify to who God is, the Most High God. Now, it's interesting, we see a similar declaration by King Darius in Daniel chapter 6, after the whole lion's den situation. Daniel 6:25, then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is a living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lion. So it's a very similar declaration. He's still talking about the God of Daniel. Whether or not Darius became a true follower of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, only God knows. Now, interestingly, in both declarations, in Daniel 4:1 and 6:25 by Nebuchadnezzar and King Darius, we see this phrase, may your peace abound. It's the only two times we see it in the book of Daniel. And this phrase is, Shalom, Shalamhon Yisgeh. May your shalom, may your peace abound. Now, this Aramaic phrase is only used by these two kings, and I just want to mention here that peace in the Middle East is only possible by coming to faith in the God of heaven, right? There's so many nations who want to make peace agreements. They want to have little activities that we do and this and that, but it's only through faith in the God of heaven and earth today through Messiah that there can be peace. And that is the only way we will see peace on this earth. Now, again, Daniel chapter 4 is the testimony of King Nebuchadnezzar, right? Again, we read in verse 3, it has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. Nebuchadnezzar is personally testifying to who and what God has done. Although Nebuchadnezzar was a mighty king, he came to know and testify to what the Most High God did in his life. The Most High God was no longer only the God of his Jewish officials, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but his own God. So let's continue in Daniel chapter 4 to read about Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. Beginning in verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them. But they could not make its interpretation known to me. But finally, Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream, which I have seen, along with its interpretation. Now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. So this is the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar explaining his dream of this tree. We read on that the tree became strong and it reached heaven and it was visible in all of the earth. So what is the context of Daniel chapter 4? And we need to remember context is king, right? It helps us to put it all together. First, talk about the date. It's sometime after the events of Daniel chapter 3, meaning after 586 BC, and it has to be before King Nebuchadnezzar died, which is in 562 BCE. So you have a 25-year window there, somewhere in that time. What was the situation of the king? He tells us, right? He says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful, and these fantasies as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. Now, these two sentences of the king's testimony tell us the location of the dream and the situation of the king. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar was in Babylon, right? And we read how he was at ease in his house and flourishing in his palace. So Now we look at this word flourishing in my palace. The word flourishing is the Aramaic word ra'anan and has the idea of something green, flourishing. It's like a fruitful tree. The king's life was good and he was at ease, and he was comparing it to this big, luscious green tree. So it's very interesting that Nebuchadnezzar is describing his situation as this luscious green tree, and then God speaks to Nebuchadnezzar through the dream with the very image that he had of himself. So it's very important to understand the wording there and what is being explained. Now, this flourishing tree is the luxury that King Nebuchadnezzar is living in, right? This beautiful palace. He was the ruler of the earth at that time, right? He ruled all the kingdoms of the earth, and he had everything his heart desired. So he had a very, I'm sure, fancy and lush palace where he could easily be at ease and enjoy his luxury. Now, rest and leisure can be good, right? Sabbath rest is biblical. Most of you know that I've written a book on the Sabbath, practicing the Sabbath with community. Sabbath is good. Rest is good. The key is to work hard the other 6 days of the week. Sometimes people forget that important counterpart, right, to Sabbath rest. It's a balance. Now, I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the subject of the danger when kings rest. The danger when kings rest. So work 6 days and rest 1. This is the example that God himself demonstrated for us, the King of the universe. When one becomes wealthy and prosperous, it is easy to then become idle and lazy. Many opportunities of evil seem to present themselves to those who are idle. An idle life, fueled by success and riches, can lead to a world of evil. I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the life of King David, because we see an example of this in his life as well. King David had great success on the battlefield and had become extremely rich and powerful. In many ways, King David was in a similar situation to King Nebuchadnezzar as the ruler of the world in his time. Now, King David ruled 400 years earlier, but he, in essence, ruled over the same area, right? He was reigning in Jerusalem, but he had full control over the Mesopotamian area. So what was the great sin in King David's life? We are all familiar with this, whether we know the Bible or not, right? 2 Samuel 11, 1-2. Then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem. Now when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David was being idle when he should have been at work. David was at his palace in Jerusalem, sleeping or resting in the daytime, and arose at evening to walk on his rooftop. It's the opposite of how life should be, right? You sleep at night, you work during the day. He kind of had things flipped around. David was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then used his power and position to get what he wanted, a married woman with whom he knowingly committed adultery. Now, Nebuchadnezzar and King David's situations were very similar. David was a king of a great kingdom, and God had blessed him in every way, but David fell into great sin due to believing the lie of power and wealth. He became proud, and he put himself above the rule of God. King David did not use his time well at the height of his worldly success, and as a result, he ended up committing adultery and murder. Nebuchadnezzar was enjoying his worldly success and basking in the extent of his wealth and accomplishments. Nebuchadnezzar could do whatever he wanted, and he did exactly that, right? As you read in verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. We must learn from the mistakes of these great kings and we need to stay alert and honor God. We need to always be alert, and we always need to remember to honor God with what we do. It's discipline. It's a very simple word. Live a godly life. Live a disciplined, godly life. Now, we can either choose to live a disciplined life according to God's word, or we can expect God's discipline in our lives, right? So if you don't discipline yourself, you will be disciplined. That's just a principle of life. Those of you who are parents, you know that well. Now, King David was known as a man after God's own heart. King David was a man who was passionate about God, right? But he allowed one sin to lead to another, and he had a great fall. Believing in God and having faith in Yeshua today are super for all of us. However, together with this faith, we must be careful to not become idle or proud. God has given each of us life, talents, and the gift of time to use on this earth in order to serve him and to serve others. How are we using our life, talents, and time? I'm asking myself this, I'm asking you this. Read the following words of exhortation by the Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians 3, 10 to 13. For even when we were with you, we used to give you this order. If anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. For we hear that some among you are leading an undisciplined life, doing no work at all, but acting like busybodies. Now such persons we command and exhort in the Lord Yeshua Messiah to work in quiet fashion and eat their own bread. But as for you, brethren, do not grow weary of doing good, right? Discipline, living a godly life. It's par for the course. Leading a disciplined life is part of honoring God with our time and energy. It does not matter how much money or power we have. We could be a poor person or a king or a queen. It doesn't matter, but it's how we use our time and our energy. There is a time to work and a time for Sabbath and vacations. We have the prime of our life to work hard, in the latter years to be less active. I make note here that Moses lived to be 120 years old and was active in God's service until God called him home. It's a good example, just saying. Stay awake and be alert, especially spiritually. Let's go back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So he started talking about the tree that covered the earth, and Nebuchadnezzar continued in verse 11. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The animals of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky lived in its branches, and all living creatures fed from it. I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted out and spoke as follows: chop down the tree and cut off its branches, shake off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. Yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the field. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the wild animals in the grass of the earth. Let his mind change from that of a human, and let an animal's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he grants it to whomever he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, tell me its interpretation, since none of the wise men of my kingdom is able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. So we'll stop there for now and just want to summarize the dream, right? So there was a lot of details in there. I just want to briefly go over them again so that they're clear in our mind. There was a great tree in the middle of the earth, which reached to the sky, literally to the heaven or to the heavens. The tree was flourishing and green, and it reached to the ends of the earth. It provided shade for animals, a home for birds in its branches, and its fruit provided food for all flesh. A quote unquote watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven and commanded the tree to be cut down. The branches were to be cut off, leaving only the stump. All of the animals and birds were to be scattered, while the stump was to remain alone. An iron band was to be placed around the stump. And then we have a change in pronouns, right? It talks about he replacing the stump. He was to be drenched with the dew of heaven and live with the beasts of the field. His heart was to be changed from that of a human being to a heart of an animal for 7 periods of time. The decree was confirmed in the end again by the watchers and by the holy ones, and the purpose of the dream was explained. The king requested that Daniel interpret the dream for him, since his wise men were unable to interpret it, and because the king knew that the spirit of God or gods lived in him. So as we get into this next section here, I just want to focus for a time on this word, the watcher, right? It speaks of this angelic watcher, a holy one descended from heaven. So who or what is a watcher? Depending on your translation here. Now we read about a unique being who delivers the message to cut down the tree and pronounce judgment, right? And it says in this translation, a watcher, a holy one. Now I just make note here that although the text refers to the watcher as angelic, the word angelic is not in the original text. Okay, it's used by translators to try to explain who this watcher is, because just saying watcher doesn't really make sense. And because it does say a holy one, they assume it is an angel. But just to say, the word angel is not in the text. It's a watcher, a holy one. So the word watcher is the Aramaic word ear, and literally means watcher or wakeful, one who is awake. Now, just for those of you who know Hebrew, right, the word ear, ein, yud, resh, it looks like the Hebrew word for city, but this is only because of the form of the word here. The Aramaic word ear is actually related to the Hebrew word or, meaning to awake, as we see in the book of Isaiah. So let's take a look at this verse, Isaiah 52:1, where it says, awake, awake, clothe yourself in your strength, O Zion. Clothe yourself in your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, for the uncircumcised and the unclean will no longer come in to you. There's a double use of the warning to awake here, and it's the verb form, right? Awake, awake, with the Hebrew words ori, ori. And this is the same meaning as the Aramaic word ear, which is a watcher, one who is awake, right? So ear is in the noun form, and we see the Hebrew in the ori, ori here. But it's the same, they're the same roots, they're the same meaning of being awake or awakening. The Aramaic word ear, watcher, one who was awake, is only used 3 times, and it's here in Daniel chapter 4, verses 13, 17, and 20. It carries the meaning of one who is awake, the vigilant one, the one who keeps watch. Now, it seems to be referring to an angel, but it is interesting to note that the Aramaic word for angel is not used, but rather this word watcher. Why not? Why would they not to simply use the word angel here? Why is this unique word watcher, one who was awake, used here? In keeping with the context, I believe that God was revealing a spiritual truth by calling the messenger a watcher, one who is awake. Nebuchadnezzar was in a spiritual stupor. He needed to be awakened spiritually. It was an act of mercy of God to alert him to his sinful ways and to call him to repent. Nebuchadnezzar was not a righteous one who had backslidden, but rather a Gentile heathen who had become proud, arrogant, and who believed that he ruled the earth. God sent him a messenger to awaken him and to warn him of what was coming. Now, it's easy to look at King Nebuchadnezzar's life and judge him along with King David's actions. However, what about you and what about me? Are we spiritually awake? Have we fallen asleep spiritually? I want to end this time with this application of staying spiritually alert. It would be wise for us to learn from their mistakes, King Nebuchadnezzar and King David. We need to stay spiritually alert. Now, Yeshua spoke a parable to his disciples regarding how to live until he comes again, right? Until his second coming. That's the context of Mark chapter 13. I want to read here verses 33 to 37, where Yeshua said, "Take heed, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It is like a man away on a journey, who upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigning to each one his tasks, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all, be on the alert." Yeshua was clearly not instructing his disciples regarding physical sleep, but rather to always remain vigilant and alert spiritually so that they do not become spiritually lazy and numb to his return. Be on the alert. I just want to point out here that the Greek word for alert, to be on the alert, is gagurio, to be awake, to watch, be on the alert, be vigilant. Sounds very familiar, right, to what we saw in Daniel chapter 4 with the ear, with the watcher, the one who is awake, right? Since the warning in Mark chapter 13 is clearly about Yeshua's coming for his people, right, his second coming, some in believing circles try to use parables like this one to defend the pre-tribulation rapture theory, saying something like, see, we will not have any idea about when Yeshua will come or return, right? Now, I just make a point here. We must always understand parables in the context of all of the scriptures. So we want to look at something that gives more clarity to this understanding of Yeshua's coming like a thief, right? Coming when we don't expect it in 1 Thessalonians 5, 1-6. Again, regarding the coming of Yeshua, now as to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day would overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night nor of darkness. So then let us not sleep as the others do, but let us be alert and sober. So according to 1 Thessalonians 5, it is those who are in the darkness, who don't know Yeshua or who aren't living it, to whom Yeshua will come as a thief, not for those who are in the light. As we read again here, right? But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day would overtake you like a thief. He's not going to come as a thief to us who are awake and alert and know him. For we are sons of light and sons of day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober. Again, right? This is the same Greek word, gagurio, to be awake, to be alert. So Nebuchadnezzar was spiritually asleep before the dream of Daniel 4. God sent his ear, his watcher, the one who is awake, to deliver a message and to wake up the king out of his spiritual sleep and to come to know the living God, right? That was the goal. It actually says that's the purpose. We must remain alert and spiritually vigilant as we continue in faith in the God of heaven, right? So it's a very practical application to what we see in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, to be spiritually alert. Be awake and be alert. So that's the conclusion to Daniel chapter 4, part 1. We will continue next week to see the outcome of this dream, the interpretation of the dream, and how it works out. So please read Daniel chapter 4 again in preparation for the next teaching. And again, I just want to thank you for joining us through this teaching of Ner L'Reglai. And I want to encourage you, if you're enjoying these teachings, feel free to share them with others. And if you can support us in any way through a donation, please just click on the Give tab and give in any manner that suits you. Thank you, and see you again next time.